Thank you. All right. Hi, everybody. Nice to be back with Jay Cook. It is my first time on a Zoom program for Jay Cook, but I was involved with Rabbi Marsha pretty much since the beginning. We did a bunch of high holiday services together in Newport Beach. Was anybody at those high holiday services in Newport Beach? No, it was a few years ago. So I am in Philadelphia. I will be back in California. Oh, Sandra. Okay, nice. Um, so I am currently in Philadelphia, wrapping up a 7-year stint at Congregation Out the Jeshurun, right outside of Philadelphia, in Elkins Park. And I'll be back in California in about 6 weeks, and I'm looking forward to being A, to being back in California, and B, to being more involved with Jay Cook. So I hope to have a chance to see you. And over in June, over the course of 3 weeks, we'll be doing a separate but related program that has to do with the subject matter of the book that I'm working on called Reconfiguring the Covenant, People, Land, and Torah. And so we'll be doing 3 sessions, one on people, one on land, and one on Torah. But today, because we have the holiday of Shavuot hanging over us like a mountain, I thought that we would look up and talk a little bit about revelation in the context of perhaps one of the most controversial ideas today within contemporary Judaism, which is the idea that we were afforded the opportunity for God's revelation as a result of being the chosen people. So it is this idea of being the chosen people that has engendered discomfort, has engendered envy, has engendered perplexity, I would say, that we want to look at over the next hour. We've got relatively few people here, so I want to invite anybody to interrupt. You can either interrupt by speaking, or there are these reaction. Yes, there's reactions, and you can raise your hand. See how I raised my hand up here? So you can do that. And now I'm going to lower my hand. And if you do that, I will see you and I will be happy to call on you. Okay. All right. So let's get going. All right. I hope that everybody can see Choosingness and Revelation. Okay. And so okay, good. All right. So before we talk about being the chosen people, I assume that some of you have a sense, but we will be more deliberative and definitive about what it means. I couldn't find any recent statistics on whether American Jews consider themselves to be the chosen people. But a couple of years ago in Israel, there was a poll, and 2/3 of Israeli Jews said yes, they believe that Jews are the chosen people as the Bible describes. So that to me was shocking. That to me was shocking. Um, it's a little less shocking because when Jews are a majority, there's not this sense of needing to look inside of the community to see yourself the way the majority sees you, because the Jews are the majority in Israel. So it's a little more sensitive and controversial of a claim that Jews are the chosen people when we're outside of a majority Jewish culture, like in America. And so that's what we are going to be taking a look at today. Okay. So there are a number of places in the Torah that get at this idea that the Jews are the chosen people. I have selected two particular passages. One of them I think might be the most famous, and that's from the book of Exodus, chapter 19. This is right before God speaks to the people of Israel. They have been liberated from slavery in Egypt. We're about to get the Decalogue, the commandments. And God says, now then, if you will obey me faithfully and keep my Brit, my covenant, You shall be my Am Segula, my treasured possession among all the peoples. So that term treasured possession has a specific meaning in the ancient Near East, and it means the property of the king and nobody but the king. It's kind of like the king's harem, right? The king's harem is what belongs to the king, and it would be a bad idea for anybody to violate the sanctity of the king's harem because it belongs to the king and only to the king. So God says, if, so it does seem to be very conditional. If you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. Indeed, all the earth is mine, but you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Mamlechet Kohanim va'am kadosh. Okay. So we're going to be taking that apart over the next couple of minutes. I'm not going to read the passage in Deuteronomy, but it very much talks about God choosing the people of Israel, again, as God's treasured possession. It has the legal language of an oath instead of a covenant, same idea. And there, the explanation for why God chose us is not because we were the biggest or the baddest or the best or the smartest or the best looking or anything like that. It's that God loved us. And it doesn't say God loved us more than other people. It says that God loved us. And as we all know, love is irrational. And love makes you do silly things, and look at what it made God do. It made God choose the Israelites. So the idea of the chosen people is going to get some really bad press as we go forward in history. So what I want to say at this point in the world of the Torah is that the idea of the chosen people can be understood in ways that are not racist, that do not demand that the Israelite people see themselves as superior to other people, but there's a special relationship that the Israelites have with God, and it doesn't prevent other peoples from also having special relationships. So take a look at Amos 9:7. Amos 9:7 says, you guys, you Israelites, you're just like the Cushites. And it could be that the Cushites is being taken here because the Cushites are from Africa. They're dark skinned. It might be a kind of way of saying that everybody in God's eyes is equal, regardless of where they're from or skin color. Yes, Israel, I brought you up from Egypt, but I brought the Philistines from their place, and I brought the Arameans from their place. So the prophet Amos in the Bible is already being explicit that whatever the covenant is that connects the Israelites and God doesn't make us superior. It just delineates a specific set of conditions. And then Amos, earlier on in his book, explains that those conditions, whatever they are, involve punishment for their violations. You alone have I singled out of all the families of the earth for these kinds of conditions, obligations, mitzvot. That's why I'm going to call you to account for all your iniquities. When you transgress the mitzvot that you have agreed to do in terms of the covenant, that's why I'm going to punish you more than the other people. So it's clear here that Amos is recognizing the existence of a covenant because it says, you alone have I singled out. But that covenant might establish a special relationship, but part of that special relationship is being punished for things that other peoples are not punished for. It's right in the Bible. It's very early on, and it's something we need to take into account when we're talking about the covenant. Okay. And the idea of chosenness. Okay. So I just want to remind everybody that a covenant is two ways, right? That's why there's a covenant of marriage. The groom has to take the bride, but the bride has to take the groom. And so we have in the book of Exodus, God takes the record of the covenant, reads it out loud to the people, and they say, we agree. Because if the Israelites wouldn't agree, then there wouldn't be a covenant. There would be a series of expectations, and we wouldn't ever know if the Israelites had accepted the terms of the covenant or not. But we do. And in terms of this Hebrew form, Na'aseh v'nishma is a really interesting combination of words. Because on the one hand, they could be understood as synonyms. We will do and we will obey. But if you're looking to get two different meanings, it would be we will do what we've already agreed to do, and we will obey in the future tense, not what's been said up until now, but how God will change the specific stipulations of the covenant in the future. Now, I love that because what the book of Deuteronomy says is that the words of the Torah are not going to change. The words of the Torah are fixed, but the idea and the ideas that are contained in the laws of the Torah, those might need to be updated. And so we might need to distill or extrapolate the rule, the principle of the laws. And in a new historical situation, we might need to write a new law that has the same function, but in a different environment, in a different political system, in a different economic system, right? We need to create a new language in order for that principle to be fulfilled. And that's what the nishma means. The other thing I'll say about nishma, right? What's the root of nishma? Shema, listen. So in Hebrew, in the Bible, I shouldn't say in Hebrew, I should say in biblical Hebrew, there is no word for obey. Obedience is not a thing. But the way the Bible communicates the idea of obedience is by hearing. In order for us to obey something, we have to hear it in a way that lands, that sits, that obligates us as a result of our hearing to commit ourselves to what it is that we have heard. That's what obedience is. There is no external obedience in this idea, in this language, right? It's not obey or else. It's obey if you have heard and understood what it is I have tried to communicate. Of course, we know that there are consequences to obeying and not obeying, but the language of nishma to function as obedience is a very kind of internal, personalized way of understanding responsibility and responsiveness. Okay, moving on. All right, moving on in a different way. There we go. All right. So far, we've only looked at the Bible. So let's jump a couple of hundred years to the Talmud. So this is the Babylonian Talmud. It's written, I don't know, it's written 1,000 years in some cases after the Bible. And it's not legal. This particular section is not legal. It's agadic. So the way that we say this in traditional language, it's not halachic, it's agadic. It's what we would call religious folklore. And it doesn't have any legal weight. It doesn't have any legal significance, but it gives you an idea of what at least Rabbi Yochanan was thinking about. So Rabbi Yochanan is one of the two great sages from the land of Israel. And what he says is, based on a verse that we're not going to take a look at, God took the Torah and peddled it to every, like that's why I put every in bold and in red, to every other nation in the entire world, and they didn't accept it. If God peddled the Torah to every other nation in the world until he came to us, it means we were the last. We were not the cream of the crop, but you will pardon the expression, the crap of the crop. Okay? And finally, when God came to the Jewish people, they said, Na'aseh v'nishma. They accepted it. And so, like, what's the motivation for Rabbi Yochanan to say such a thing, right? He's being challenged with the idea of, why are you Judeans? Why are you Israelites? Why are you Jews, the chosen people? And so what he says is, to everybody who's asking him this question, is, look, you guys had your chance and you passed. So by the time God had exhausted all other possibilities, we said, okay, we'll do it. We'll take it. We'll be in a covenantal relationship with you. So before we move from the slide, I just want to emphasize two things. One is that it's not just that God peddled the Torah to every nation, but God peddled the Torah to every language. This is as universalistic a midrash or an idea from the rabbis as you're going to get, because it really says that no matter where people belonged, no matter which language they spoke, God wanted to be in a covenantal relationship with them, and God might be in a different covenantal relationship with something other than the Torah, but with the Torah, it's us, and we were God's last choice. Okay. In the Talmud, there is another passage that is not universalist, but very particularist. So people are familiar with original sin, with the Catholic Christian idea that we have all inherited from Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden the stain of original sin when Adam and Eve disobeyed God by eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So just a little cocktail trivia here. There are two issues with Jesus not having original sin. So original sin and the Immaculate Conception are the opposites of one another. Macula in Latin means stain. So Immaculate Conception means without the stain of original sin. So Jesus's mom, Mary's mother conceived Mary through good old-fashioned sex, but without the stain of original sin. So Immaculate Conception refers to Mary. Mary, therefore, doesn't have the stain of original sin, nor did she have sex with Joseph in order to produce Jesus. So Jesus is a product of both an immaculate conception with Mary and a virgin birth, because Mary didn't have sex, right? So usually when people talk about Immaculate Conception, it's not Jesus they're talking about, it's Mary. So that's just a little cocktail trivia that you can throw in and win points with your Christian friends that you might know something about Jesus's birth and original sin that they might not know. Okay. With regard to the Jewish people who stood at Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, their stain, their pollution, their contamination from the serpent, that in this particular passage, the idea is that it was the serpent who impregnated Eve. That ended. It was expelled. It was expunged. But the Gentiles who didn't stand at Mount Sinai to get the Torah, their contamination has not ended. They do have original sin. They're right. When they talk about original sin, they are 100% right for them. For us, it ended at Mount Sinai. So it's a way of saying, you guys want your original sin, you got it. It's just not one of our issues. And what I put down at the bottom here is that this idea of being superior to other peoples was universalist, right? This particularist idea of our particular people being better than everybody else, everybody had this idea. The Greeks had the idea, the Romans had the idea, Christianity, right? There's no way to get to God except through Jesus. They had the idea. Muslims have the idea. Hegel thought that the Germans were the most superior people. Dostoevsky thought the Russians were the most superior people. So, although many, not all, but although many of these claims of superiority have fallen by the wayside in the modern period, at the time when the chosen people concept emerged, it was to be assumed that many people considered themselves to be the best, right? So the word barbarian comes from the Greek description of people who don't speak Greek. They're going bar, 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 bar. Because it was only if you knew Greek that you were a sophisticated, cosmopolitan human being. We in Hebrew have the exact same idea, but instead of saying barbarian, we say Babel, right? That's why the Tower of Babel, everybody else who doesn't speak Hebrew, they're babbling. They're babbling. But Hebrew is the language in which God communicated to the Israelites. All right. When we move from the rabbinic period, from the Talmud, say the 4th, 5th century of the Common Era, another 700-800 years to the Middle Ages, we divide things into two primary buckets. There are the philosophical rationalists who understand the chosen people one way, and there are the mystics who understand the chosen people in a totally different way. So we're going to take a look at more on the philosophical side, but I also need to share with you the mystical side. So Maimonides is the great philosopher of the Middle Ages. In 1180, he wrote the Guide of the Perplexed. And he goes back and comments on this idea of being a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. How does he understand it? Knowledge of God, which is a function of learning Aristotle. I'm going to say that again. For Maimonides, what it means to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation is to know physics and metaphysics according to the greatest Greek philosopher, Aristotle. It's about knowledge. And knowledge is something that is universally available and has nothing to do with the Torah, nothing necessarily to do with the Torah that was given at Mount Sinai. It's all about knowledge. As opposed to Jewish mysticism. In the world of Jewish mysticism, what it means to be a chosen people is that there is something in our essence, in reality, like essentially in our essence, that makes us more divine than non-Jews. In the world of Jewish mysticism, taken from the book of Ezra, taken from that passage that we saw about original sin in the Talmud, Jews are intrinsically, inherently at a higher, more holy, more divine level than non-Jews. We see that in Yehuda Halevi, one of the medieval poets and philosophers. We see that in the great book of Jewish mysticism, the Zohar. In the 16th century, Isaac Luria in Tzvat. And it has filtered into ultra-Orthodox Judaism today, and the Bible of Chabad or Lubavitch mysticism is called the Tanya. And the Tanya, the book that was written by the Alter Rebbe, by the founder of Chabad and Lubavitch, begins his book, the Tanya, with this idea that the Gentiles have an animal soul, but they're missing the divine soul that Jews were bestowed with. So this idea of the chosen people can become explicitly racist, and in certain traditions within historical Judaism and contemporary Judaism, it continues to be racist. That's not easy to accept. It's not easy to hear. But if we don't know it, then we can't repudiate it. We can't reject it if we don't know about it. Okay. So I wanted to just show you how the rationalist philosopher Maimonides, also called the Rambam, looks and describes at how Abraham was chosen to be the founder of the Jewish people. So in the Torah, it says, God said to Abram, before his name was changed, go forth from Ur Kasdim, go forth from your father's house to the land that I will show you. Where is that land? Israel. Canaan. Canaan. Okay. That is the Torah. And so now I'm not going to read all this to you, I promise. But what Maimonides does is he describes how Abraham came to be in the land of Israel. He began to explore and think. And what was he thinking about? How was it possible for the sphere, meaning the stars and the sun and the earth, to continue to revolve without having anyone controlling it? Who is causing it to revolve? That's what you thought Abraham was thinking about Sodom and Gomorrah. You thought Abraham was thinking about who he's going to ask to the high school dance. Is it going to be Sarah or is it going to be somebody else in class? No. He was thinking about science. And as a result of his accurate comprehension, meaning he figured it out, he realized that there was one God and only one God who controlled the sun, the sphere. And he started spreading that knowledge. And when he started convincing people that there was only one God, through the strength of his arguments, the king of Ur Kasdim desired to kill him. But he was saved and he escaped to Haran. And then from Haran, he went to Canaan. So there's two things that you need to understand about what Maimonides is doing here. The first is the most radical. God doesn't speak. God doesn't speak to Abraham. God doesn't speak to Moses. God doesn't speak to the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. You know why? Because to speak, you have to have vocal cords, which mine are bothering me, as you can hear. You have to have a throat, you have to have a mouth, you have to have a tongue. Speech requires an entire apparatus that is physical, corporeal, and God is incorporeal. God doesn't have a body. So what Maimonides says is whenever the Torah says God speaks, you have to understand that figuratively because God doesn't actually speak in words like I'm speaking or like you are invited to speak anytime you would like to make a comment or ask me a question. So the other thing that we get, and this is perhaps just as difficult or more difficult for some of you, and it certainly is for some people, to acknowledge that God doesn't tell Abraham to go to Israel. In the Torah, it says, go to the land that I will show you. And that turns out to be Israel. For Maimonides, Abraham is on the lam. He's running away. He's escaping for his life. And he goes to Haran and then he ends up in Canaan. But it's not because God told him to go there. What this means for Maimonides is that whatever is special or holy about the land of Israel is not a function of Israel by itself. It's a function of what Jews do in Israel, their behavior in Israel. That's what makes Israel holy. It's an attributed holiness, not an intrinsic holiness. I hope you can see how radically rational this is and how subversive this is to the plain sense of the Torah. So Maimonides was a rationalist, and in the 12th century, that was a dangerous thing to be. And so he very frequently had to phrase and articulate his understanding of the Torah in a way that was not explicit. Like he doesn't come right out and say, God doesn't speak. He actually does say that in the Guide of the Perplexed. But this is how he explained it first in 1170. The Guide of the Perplexed is 1180. And his whole point in both works is that we need to understand the Torah as religious literature. We can't read, just like we don't read literature literally, we read it literarily. We also need to read the Torah literarily, as literature and as poetry. Okay. The 16th century is very interesting because in the land of the Renaissance, in 16th century Italy, you've got a more, I was going to use the word rationalist. So we can use rationalist, but it's a more humanitarian. That's a better word. It's a more humanitarian understanding of what it means to be a kingdom of priests. Because if you think about it, what's the role of a priest? A priest ministers to a congregation. But if the whole kingdom are priests, to whom are the priests ministering? Right? In Exodus, when it says that we are going to be a kingdom of priests and a holy people, if we're all priests, then we're not ministering to one another amongst the holy people. We're ministering to those outside of the community. And so Sforno in the 16th century says, what does it mean to be a kingdom of priests? It means that we teach and instruct all of humanity the spiritual truth of monotheism and how it is that God wants us to worship God, to serve God together. Meanwhile, right, I would say this is the Renaissance, this is humanitarian up in Sfat, with Isaac Luria in the Kabbalah, What we have is that and what happens in the 16th century, I'm just going to remind everybody, you all know, in 1492, which I understand is the 15th century, in 1492, we are exiled from Spain. That was the biggest trauma to the Jewish people since the temple was destroyed by the Romans in the year 69 or 70. A handful of years later, many of the Jews who were exiled from Spain who had gone to Portugal, exiled from Portugal. A handful of years later, in 1517, something pretty radical happened. The land of Israel changed governments from an Arab government to a Turkish government. The Ottoman Empire was in control of the land of Israel from 1517 to 1917. And lots of Jews who had been exiled from Spain and Portugal had gone to the Ottoman Empire because King Suleiman invited us. King Suleiman sent ships to Spain to bring us to the Ottoman Empire. And he said, King Ferdinand, you're such a schmuck, right? You're kicking out the Jews. They're the ones who make the economy turn. I'm bringing him to my kingdom. But once we were in the Ottoman Empire and Palestine came under the jurisdiction of the Ottoman Empire, a bunch of Jews went to the land of Israel because there was no longer any border that was a problem to cross. And so in Sfat, in the middle of the 16th century, from 1525 to 1575, it's almost like the axial age of Judaism. There was so much incredible learning that came out of Tzfat. And part of that learning was Kabbalah, Lurianic, Isaac Luria, his Kabbalah. And what scholars describe it as now, it makes so much sense. As Jews were kicked out and oppressed and persecuted in the physical world, our literature reflects a superiority and a command of the metaphysical world. So in order to compensate for how lowly we were in the real political, physical world, the literature and the mystical literature in particular elevated us, promoted us to being in control of the metaphysical realms, of the supernal realms. And part of what came out of that process was that we have this aspect of divinity in our souls that's able to connect with the supernal realms and God. And the animals who are behaving like animals and killing and raping and exiling us, they don't have that divine element of their soul. And so it's in the 16th century that this idea really becomes widespread, that the Jews and the Gentiles have different neshamas, have different souls altogether. Okay. Okay. We're now jumping to modernity, my friends. And what I mean by modernity is the political emancipation of the Jews in America and in Western Europe. And what is emancipation? Emancipation says that you Jews, are no longer collective members of the Jewish corporation in the lands in which you live, but as individuals, you are citizens of the country. So you're no longer a member of the Jewish community who happens to live under the jurisdiction of Germany or under the jurisdiction of Austria or under the jurisdiction of France. You're now a French citizen of the Mosaic persuasion, of the Hebrew persuasion, a French Jew. It begins in the late 18th century, it goes into the 19th century, different parts of Germany different parts of Europe emancipate their Jews at different times. One of the first Jewish leaders to write about this new Jewish self-identity is Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. He's the founder of modern Orthodoxy in Germany, second half of the 19th century. The book that he wrote that's very, very readable is called The 19 Letters of Ben Uziel. And this is what he says. It's our duty to join ourselves as closely as possible to the state, to any state, which receives us in its midst to promote its welfare and not to consider our own well-being as in any way separate from that of the state to which we belong. This close connection with states everywhere is not at all in contradiction to the spirit of Judaism. For the independent, and this is the Chiddush, this is like what's totally radical. For the independent national life of Israel was never the essence or purpose of our existence as a nation. Oh, yes, it was. That's exactly what it was up until emancipation. But he's saying, no, it may have looked like that, but that's not really what the purpose of Judaism was. The purpose of Judaism was to have this independent nation only as a means of fulfilling our spiritual mission, teaching, to bring a light unto the nations, to teaching other peoples about the oneness of God and how to worship God, going back to that Renaissance idea of Sforno. And that we had thought that the best way to do that was by having our own nation. But the point was never to have our own nation. It was to have our own nation in order to be a light unto the nations. And if we can be a light unto the nations because we're accepted as a legitimate, fully equal religion in France and Germany and Austria and the United States, great. That's all we need. Because what our goal is a spiritual mission, not a political mission. That's news. But if you're trying to fit into Germany, what you don't want to do is to say that we have a political mission according to what we have been praying for 3 times a day. And what we have been praying for 3 times a day is to go back to the land of Israel and reestablish Jewish political sovereignty under the descendant of King David. All right, it's 1:58. Oh my God. Oh no, we started at 2:15. We're going till, okay, we got another 15 minutes. Okay, we're good. We're good. Okay. We're shifting now to America. In America, there was real discomfort with the, so in Europe, this idea of the chosen people was about a spiritual mission. We're not chosen by God to be better than, we're chosen by God to teach, to minister to the peoples, this idea of ethical monotheism. But it didn't sit so well with American Jews because America itself was an exceptional country. America itself was built not on Christian principles, but on biblical principles, the city on the hill, and this idea of every person having been created equal. That language of the Declaration of Independence comes right out of Genesis 1. Every human being is created in the divine image. Thomas Jefferson and the founders didn't want to be that explicitly religious, unlike Christian nationalist belief today. So the way in which that religious idea from Genesis that we're all created in the divine image was translated into political terms, we take these truths to be self-evident, that all human beings are created as equals. Okay. So if that's true, and we want to be good Americans, then God didn't choose us, but we have in the mid-20th century, specifically by the Reformed community, is we chose God, right? And what difference does it really make whether God chose us or we chose God? They say. right? It's a covenant. We're in it together. And some of these names you might be familiar with: Abba Hillel Silver, Samuel Cohen, Stephen S. Weiss. They all flipped the script. And instead of talking about a chosen people, they spoke about a choosing people. The only person to buck the trend was Mordechai Kaplan. Mordechai Kaplan was a conservative rabbi. He was the head of the Reconstructionist wing of conservative Judaism until Reconstructionism broke off in the 60s to be its own separate denomination. And he said, look, there's 5 problems with this idea of the chosen people, right? Exactly what Shimshon Raphael Hirsch in Germany wanted to avoid, this perception of dual loyalty. Are we more committed to our people, our other chosen people, regardless of where they live, or are we more committed to being Americans? It's a theological absurdity, right? God doesn't intervene and pick one people out and say to one people what God doesn't say to other people. Psychologically, it's problematic because it gives us a superiority complex, right? We think we're better than other people. Sociologically, it elicits envy. Other people say, oh, you think you're the chosen people? You're not the chosen people. And finally, it's not democratic, right? In a democracy, everybody is equal. Nobody is chosen by God or by the government, right? The Establishment Clause says that no religion is better than any other religion. The Democratic Clause says no kinds of people are better than other kinds of people. And so Mordechai Kaplan rejected the idea of the chosen people. He rejected it vocally. He changed the prayers in the prayer book to reflect it. And he talked about it kind of incessantly because it was one of the primary distinctions between conservative Judaism, or it was one of the primary distinctions he had with Reform Judaism, and it was an argument that he had within conservative Judaism until Mordechai Kaplan left to break away, and the Reconstructionist wing became the Reconstructionist movement. Okay. So instead of being the chosen people, Mordechai Kaplan used the idea of a vocation, of a calling, to get functionally at the same idea. And so this quote is not from Mordechai Kaplan, it's from Arnold Eisen, the former chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary. And I am going to read this to you because I think it really, in ways that Mordechai Kaplan might not have said it so succinctly, sums up this idea. God remains an objectively real process, which working through us, but transcending us, makes life worthwhile by furthering the causes of freedom, salvation, human cooperation, and righteousness. Meaning to life, right? That life has meaning comes from knowing of the perfected unity for which God works, right? You have to know that this is where the world is going with God's help, and from joining in that work. Only our faith in its accomplishment enables us to join the work, and only our own choice, our own agency, our own willpower accomplishes it. It doesn't have quite the ring of the chosen people. Mordechai Kaplan was trying to attract an educated American population that was aware of social science and science in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and this was the kind of language that he used. But people who were attacking Mordechai Kaplan's rejection of the chosen people comment said, look, we can just do what you did. We can reconstruct it, right? We can revalue this idea of the chosen people. You can say about every American except Native Americans that they came from somewhere. They've got some kind of affinity with other people from the countries in Europe, usually at that point, from which they came. So having a country in Israel or having country people spread all over the diaspora, that doesn't make us particularly suspect of dual loyalty. And teach people we don't think that we're superior, right? We're called on to be better people. Some of us are better at taking the call and heeding the call than others, but it's not something intrinsic, it's something aspirational. And look how well this democratic idea dovetails with the American idea of manifest destiny, right? Judaism and its call can actually further American notions of American exceptionalism. And America is founded on this idea of equality, and that idea of equality comes from having been created in the image of God. But Mordecai Kaplan fights back, and he says, look, you can educate and teach and pontificate until you're blue in the face, but anti-Semites are going to project whatever anti-Semites are going to project on us, and it's not going to be good for the Jews. When they say that the Jews think they're the chosen people, and we say, well, yes, but, that's not going to end up well for us, that yes, but. It's much easier to say no. And even if your educational program could succeed, can we just be honest for a minute? Does anybody still think that God has that kind of personal interventionist characteristic that God can reach in and point and say, you guys are chosen for this mission? What Mordecai Kaplan says is that even if we could get rid of all the other problems, that's not how God works. Nobody believes that anymore, especially after the Holocaust. How can you believe in anything like divine intervention in the way that the traditional texts sometimes talk? We need to jettison, we need to reject that idea. And as a result of biblical scholarship, we don't take the Torah as a source of history anymore. We haven't for 200 years. And so we need to overcome this idea that turns out to be pernicious, and it turns out to work to the detriment of the Jewish community by having the accusation that we somehow think we are better. Now I'm arguing. I want to flip the script. Catholics in 1962 to 1965 had the Second Vatican Council. They said that you can be in right relationship to God without being Catholic. They did something functionally similar to rejecting the idea that they were the chosen people and that the only way to God was through them. That was in 1965, Second Vatican Council, Nostra Aetate. Today, not today, yesterday, on the Mall in the capital of our country, a poll came out last week. 17% of all Americans say that Christianity should be the official religion of the United States. 27% of Republicans, 8% of Democrats. That's not good for the Jews. I think that we should model religious pluralism. Pluralism is not relativism. Doesn't mean that everything is equally good or everything is equal, but it means that no single religion has the whole truth, that we can learn from multiple religions, and explicitly repudiating the idea that Jews are the chosen people provides a pretty high-profile example for Christians and Muslims, which is at least as important, that they also need to get on the modern train and recognize that these ideas of chosenness belong to an antiquated worldview. So I want to remind people and maybe teach people. When Anwar Sadat was assassinated, because he had made peace with Israel in 1982. That's when he was assassinated. It was this group of Islamic fundamentalists whose ideology is shared by Hezbollah and by Hamas. They are not anti-Semitic in origin. I want to emphasize that. Hamas is not anti-Semitic. What Islamic Jihad and Hamas and Hezbollah believe is that no one but Muslims can have political sovereignty in the Dar al-Islam, in the historical abode of Islam, other than Muslims. It's not about Jews being particularly pernicious. It's about not being Muslims. Only Muslims, according to this ideology, this fundamentalist ideology, can have political sovereignty where the abode of Islam historically was. That's not going to be conducive to Israel having peace. If we want to be treated as equals, which means not being treated as dhimmi, being protected but tolerated minorities, we should reject the racism of our own religious fundamentalists like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who see Arabs as fundamentally, essentially, in their essence, inferior than Jews. And they're not afraid to say it, and they have good, meaning valid, Jewish religious texts that we've seen upon which to base that racism. Okay, I'm wrapping up here, folks, and I'm going to leave a couple of minutes for questions. What does it mean? What does it cost us to reject chosenness? You change the language of Asher Bachar Banu in Kiddush, in the Torah blessing. Aleinu, meaning the beginning of Aleinu, talks about giving us a destiny that God didn't give to the Gentiles. And Havdalah is perhaps the most offensive language that needs to be changed, where in Havdalah we're making all these distinctions between good and bad and light and darkness and Israel and the nations. So that means that Israel goes in the good and light category, and the nations go in the bad and dark category, right? Holy and profane. So that also needs to be tweaked. But I think on a more fundamental level, there's internal work that we need to do, some of us, that we need to stop believing that we're chosen. We need to be less defensive. We need to recognize that we can be financial frauds, and we can be exploitative and sexual predators, and we can commit war crimes too. We are not somehow immune as a result to having this special divine status. Finally, the last thing that I want to say, this is my last slide. So what is it that we can celebrate on Shavuot? If we're not celebrating being the chosen people through that legal covenant that was established at Mount Sinai, Revelation also means the revealing of God's presence, not just the revealing of God's will through Torah. And a very recent book, you can't really see it, In God's Presence, a Theological Reintroduction to Judaism, what Alon Goshen Gottstein, who lives in Israel, says is that Judaism is the enduring story of Israel's life in God's presence. God's presence is the goal, purpose, and meaning of the story of Judaism. I lied. There is one more slide. This is it. And the idea of where we go about finding God's presence very much depends on which community you believe, which community you belong to, sorry. For the Misnagdim, for the Vilna Gaon, the only place to find God's presence is through the study of Torah. For Hasidim, God's presence fills the entire world, and what our obligation is to see God's presence through the veil of corporeality and materialism that separates us from experiencing God's presence in everything in the world. For Martin Buber, it means looking at other human beings not as objects but as subjects. from an it to a thou. And once we relate to them as a subject, to be able to see the divine thou that is behind their individual subjectivity. And Franz Rosenzweig, for Franz Rosenzweig, revelation is an ever-recurring event in the inner life of human beings. It's not an objective historical event in the past at Mount Sinai, but it's a constant reaffirmation of such an event in our subjective experience. And that then takes us back to Hasidism, where what experiencing revelation is trying to understand and feel and be aware of God's presence in every aspect of the fullness of God's world. Melo chol haaretz kavodo. And with that, I will stop and open it up to questions and comments.
Thank you very much. It was a great class. Very articulate. Thank you.
Thank you, Shirley. I loved that comment. I'm happy to have a dozen more comments like that. But if anybody has a question or a challenge, I'm happy to try to field it. Sandra, did you have your hand up, or is that just a finger? Just a finger. Okay. It was a lot, especially at the end, but I wanted to help people understand what the stakes are, right? The cost in terms of liturgical modification is relatively small. There's a couple of prayers that you need to change. But being able to really come out and say that this idea of the chosen people is pernicious and that it's not exclusive to the Jewish community, but we've got the negative consequences of religious communities feel chosen in the Christian community and in the Muslim community. And both of those communities have explicit dangers to Israeli Jews and American Jews that require us to be proactive in rejecting this idea of chosenness as an example for the communities in which we live and the communities in which we struggle against.
Thank you, Rabbi Shai. This was eye-opening.
Thank you. And I hope that as we accept the Torah again at Mount Sinai, that we're able to read and understand the Torah figuratively in a way that helps us be more sensitive to God's presence, not just historically, but today in our world, not just through other human beings, but through the fullness of God's divinity that pulsates in our world. So thanks, everybody, and I look forward to learning with you in June. Chuck, are you saying goodbye, or do you have a question, Chuck? You're just saying goodbye. Okay, everybody, goodbye. Have a great day, and Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.